Alright, let's get this over and done with. So during this video, there are three main things I want to talk about. Firstly, I'll be talking about the DLCs for Breath of the Wild, sort of rounding out my Why Breath of the Wild Sucks videos. I'll be going over the DLCs, what they got right, what they got wrong, so imagine this sort of like a 3.5 of those videos. Then I'll be talking about my expectations for Breath of the Wild, and how it did in turn not meet those expectations. Some of my expectations were fair, some of them unfair, and that will lead me directly onto part 3, Breath of the Wild 2, Tears of the Kingdom, and what it needs to do in order to win me over, so to speak. So let's jump straight into the DLC for Breath of the Wild. There were 3 DLC packs added to Breath of the Wild: Master Trials, Trial of the Sword, and Champion's Ballad. So for the first DLC, Master Trials, they only added a handful of features. It was more like a congratulations, you bought the DLC for Breath of the Wild. Here's a couple of things to do while you wait for the real DLCs to come out. But some of the features they added were pretty neat, like Hero's Path. It shows you where you've been in the last 200 hours of play. It shows deaths as well. Personally, I just really like syncing it up with my own memory when I look at it and go, oh yeah, I remember doing that and going on that route. It was also cool for when I was making my Breath of the Wild videos. I could use it to retrace my steps for when I was grabbing footage for the video. I just think it's a neat feature overall. Then we have the travel medallion found in the Akala ruins to the north under the maze building. I don't really find it all that useful though, since Breath of the Wild doesn't really require that much backtracking. The only time I do find it to be super useful is for the shrine quest where you have to stand on the pedestal naked while it's a blood moon, so it makes returning back to that pedestal quickly really easy. But other than that, it's not that great of a feature. I mean, where do you actually put it? I don't know, put it in your favorite spot where you'd like to watch the sunset, I guess? And for the final feature of the Master Trials DLC, it adds Master Mode. The first problem I have with this is it's a paid feature. Pretty much every Zelda game after Skyward Sword has a hero mode included for free, which doubles damage taken, removes heart drops from pots and enemies, meaning the only way to get health back is by using healing materials stored in bottles like fairies, potions, and milk. You can also heal by picking up pieces of heart, but they're only one-time pickups, so they're not super reliable. But for a normal Zelda game, I actually like hero mode, since it makes me use a part of Zelda games I'd never usually interact with, and that's the potions. Getting hearts to drop via enemies and breakables is not that hard to do, so it's quite hard to die in a normal Zelda game, so being forced to prepare ahead of time and stock up on potions is a nice refreshing change for repeat playthroughs, as well as having to be a little more careful since all damage sources are doubled. But for Breath of the Wild, it's not as good. One thing I do love is how they changed up enemy locations, keeping the fights fresh, but it's Breath of the Wild, so you never actually have to do combat. And another problem I have is a problem Breath of the Wild already has, and that's the beginning of the game is the hardest part of the game, and you are only extending the duration of the beginning of the game by making the enemy stronger. I think it's an okay feature if you want that extra challenge, but it's something that I only checked out once just to see what it was like. So to sum up Master Trials, I think it's okay, but it's a bunch of features I feel should have been free DLC. The other two should be paid for, of course, but not this one. Like I said, Master Mode is a free feature that has been added to most remasters of 3D Zelda games, so it being paid for here feels just a little bit scummy to me. Now on to Trial of the Sword. This DLC is my overall favourite, taking the form of combat trials just like the Cave of Ordeals from Twilight Princess and the Savage Labyrinth from Wind Waker, where you go from floor to floor clearing out enemies in order to progress. In Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, you could only bring in a limited amount of healing materials stored in your bottles, and you need to do these because enemies now no longer drop hearts, so there's no way to restore health excluding using the grappling hook on moblin enemies in Wind Waker. I really wish this wasn't a thing. It completely trivializes the Savage Labyrinth, making it so easy you don't even need to fill any bottles. But even without using the grappling hook, neither Wind Waker nor Twilight Princess's caves are that hard, because if you have maxed out bottles completely stocked with blue potions, it's pretty hard to fail. But Breath of the Wild has a small twist. Instead of allowing you to bring in healing resources, you can only use what weapons, armor, and food the trials provide for you, for obvious reasons. If you could bring in maxed out armor and a whole game's worth of food resources, it would be literally impossible to lose. So they made it so you can't do that by only giving you a limited amount of resources, which was a really great idea. So the way you access the Trial of the Sword is after you pull out the Master Sword, you can plunge the Master Sword straight back into the pedestal, transporting you into the trial, which there are 3 of. first consisting of 12 floors for you to clear, the second with 16, and the third and final with 23, each with increasing difficulty, and once you beat a single trial, your Master Sword is powered up, giving it 10 extra damage per swing from that point onward. Now I really love this since you can access the DLCs once you pull out the Master Sword, meaning if you come here as early as possible having a minimum of 13 hearts, you can pull out the Master Sword and can do the trials while having extremely low health. It's risky but worth it because having a max buff Master Sword for most of the game is a lot of fun. But of course you have to have the skills to pay the bills in order to get those upgrades. The first two trials are not that hard to do with 13 hearts, but the last one is much more difficult given the stronger enemies you'll be encountering that can flat out one-shot you, or at the very least leave you with little health left if you do get hit. And that leads on to another thing that I like about these trials, and that's it takes Breath of the Wild's combat to its extreme. You'll want to use every trick up your sleeve, like stealth for example. While it's not always an option, you'd be mad to not at least try for stealth, given it means you don't actually have to directly confront an enemy, meaning little to no danger on your part as well as big damage. So it saves durability on your weapons, stuff that you'd never normally need to do in the base game. But overall, it's one of the few times where they actually get Breath of the Wild's combat right. Also, a few people mentioned that the maxed out Master Sword that you get for beating all 3 trials is too powerful, and it is really powerful, but I think it's totally okay given the fact that you did beat the game's most difficult combat challenge. So I think you've earned the right to completely destroy the base game with it. It also makes up for the pitiful excuse for a Master Sword that we got in the base game of Breath of the Wild that breaks after just 40 swings, while the powered up version lasts for a whopping 188. So for the regular Master Sword, you use it for about 2 minutes before it breaks, then you have to wait 10 minutes for it to recharge, so you ended up waiting for it longer than you actually used it for. And again, this is the legendary Master Sword we're talking about here, the Blade of Evil's Bane. I mean, it wasn't even the most powerful sword in Ocarina of Time, second to the Goron sword, but it's nice to have the Master Sword not be practically useless. But overall, the second DLC for Breath of the Wild I think is a lot of fun, and you actually get a good reward for beating it. And again, this is something Breath of the Wild's base game is not great at. The only thing I don't really like about this DLC is this kind of combat trial is not new for Zelda games. Like I previously mentioned with Twilight Princess and Wind Waker, they have these. So to have it be paid for in this game, it kinda sucks, but I don't mind it at all since it is really fun, but it is something that does bother me just a little bit. So now for the Champion's Ballad, the final DLC for Breath of the Wild, and it's a total mixed bag. So it starts off really well with a one-hit obliterator challenge where you get the aptly named one-hit obliterator, which does exactly that. Obliterates anything you hit with it in one hit, but with the trade-off that you also get one-tapped. Getting hit by anything will cause Link to collapse, so after beating the 4 divine beasts, you can return to the Great Plateau's Shrine of Resurrection to enter this trial. Then you're tasked with defeating all enemies at 4 locations around the Great Plateau, then you complete the 4 shrines that appear afterwards. I find this part of the DLC to be quite fun. It's a lot of fun to be a complete glass cannon and having to play it a lot safer than you normally would have to since healing is useless. And you also have to do the shrines under the effects of the one-hit obliterator, and they gave me exactly what I wanted. I was hoping for one of the shrines to be a test of strength, and they did it. It feels so good to be able to obliterate this guy in one hit. Then, after doing all shrines on the Great Plateau, the one-hit obliterator will break into 4 parts and activate 4 pillars around Hyrule within eyeshot distance to each respective divine beast. And this is where the Champion's Ballad takes a massive downturn straight into some Ganon goop. So once you approach one of the 4 pillars that have recently appeared, Kass will harass you and tell you about his dead teacher, sing a song about the 3 trials that you're going to have to soon do. The pillars also have the locations of the 3 trials, and pretty much all the trials you have to do are quite lame. I mean, they all have at least one where you have to move through rings of light under a time limit. Some of them make you do stuff that you've already done in the base game, like sneaking into the Yuka clan and having to shoot targets at the Rito shooting range. There's even one that requires you to wait for a dragon to show up, then you have to shoot it in the horn. because yes, I loved doing the first 12 times. Thanks for making me do it again. So once you do those trials, new shrines show up, and these shrines are okay. Some are pretty fun, like this crane conveyor belt one, but there are some really basic and easy ones, like what's in the box. You just have to count the amount of certain types of glowing orbs in the box, and this feels like something that would fit perfectly into the collection of super basic shrines in the base game, but other than that one stinker, the others are okay. It's just after doing 120 shrines in the base game, to have to do 12 more really sucks, especially since this is paid DLC. You would expect something with a bit more oomph to it, or something that's drastically different from the stuff in the base game. Also, the new shrines that show up on the Great Plateau get a pass because they're done while under the effects of the one-hit obliterator, making them feel more unique, unlike the Divine Beast shrines. I know it's only 12 more, but it feels like too many, and it drags the DLC down quite a lot for me. Once you eventually beat the 3 respective Divine Beast shrines, you return to that Divine Beast and rematch the 4 lame as heck Blight Ganon boss fights. I don't really understand why they made you do these again, especially since you have each Divine Beast champion's abilities, so you can easily take them down. And that brings up a question: how did the Divine Beast champions even manage to lose to these guys? The only champion I could actually see losing is Mipha, because she's the least combat able out of the 4, but Rivoli, Daruk, and Urbosa should have been able to take them down. Rivoli is a really skilled marksman and should have been able to identify the obvious eyeball weak point and stun lock the boss like we're able to do, as well as the fact that Rivoli can fly. Daruk should have been able to defeat him as well, given Goron's natural immunity to fire, the element that this boss is imbued with, as well as having Goron's natural defense, on top of having Daruk's protection. And for Urbosa, she has Urbosa's Fury. Need I say more? And she proved to us that she can shield parry, a technique that's quite difficult to pull off. That being said, I do actually see Urbosa's fight going either way, given how fast and difficult Thunderblight Ganon is, so it's a maybe for her, even though I still lean towards Urbosa winning. So once you beat the bosses again, they each reward you with a 50% cooldown reduction to each of the champion abilities. Hey, remember that part in my second Why Breath of the Wild Sucks video where I talked about how broken Urbosa's Fury is? Well, now times that by 2 because you can use it double as often. Now it only has a 6-minute cooldown. It still has all the same game-breaking issues as before, but now worse. It's still way too easy to get for something this powerful and for how little effort you put in. I would have preferred some different functionality from the upgraded champion abilities. For example, I think it would have been better if you got 5 charges from Rivoli's Gale and each has an individual charge timer, so you don't have to use all of them up before they start to recharge. And for Urbosa's Fury, the range should be increased as well as the damage and stun timer instead of just reducing the cooldown timer. I think that would be much more interesting. And for Daruk's protection, after you use one of the charges, Link gains a fleeting barrier where any damage taken while this barrier is up deals no damage. So it's quite similar to Naru's Love from Ocarina of Time, but with a much shorter duration. Mipha's Grace is the only one that I think should actually have a cooldown reduction. So now it's time for the final part of the Champion's Ballad, and they really bring it home in the end. So you return once again to the Great Plateau Shrine of Resurrection, and that takes you down an elevator to the new Divine Beast. And I'll be honest, I don't have anything bad to say about this part. I think the final Divine Beast is great. Firstly, I like the atmosphere here. The fact that it's underground is really cool, and the way the light from the surface filters in and shows all the dust particles in the air, as well as the dust falling from the ceiling, makes this place feel like it's been undisturbed for a very long time, which pairs very nicely with what you do while you're here. I love how you activate this machine piece by piece, plugging in certain things to get it all up and running again, and how each wing of the Divine Beast is themed around the themes of the other Divine Beasts. It has a very final dungeon feel to it, like most Zelda games' final dungeons do, which is something that I really enjoy. That being said, I do think this Divine Beast is great by Breath of the Wild standards, but it's still far below a normal Zelda game's dungeons. At least the boss in this Divine Beast is way better than those Blights. Not that that was hard to top though. I do also really enjoy this boss for the same reason I enjoy Calamity Ganon. He just has so many attacks that he can cycle through, and you just have to deal with them. I do think it's funny that this monk is harder than Calamity Ganon, and he could probably just defeat Calamity Ganon while Link was sleeping in the Shrine of Resurrection. Anyway, after you defeat the monk, you get the long-awaited Master Cycle 0. I think it's funny that they definitely stole this idea from Mario Kart 8, which had a motorbike called the Master Cycle, and that was way back in 2014. So what Breath of the Wild did was slapped a 0 on the end of it and called it a day. But I really do love the Master Cycle. It's exactly what Breath of the Wild needed. It makes what's probably the most boring part of Breath of the Wild, the navigation, much more interesting, since it's just a lot of fun to ride around on this bike. You can do jumps and summon it wherever you need it, and it makes doing all 120 shrines much less of a chore to do, since you can get around much quicker now, which is exactly what I did for my second playthrough of this game. But that's the real shame. If you got this DLC after doing pretty much everything in Breath of the Wild, the Master Cycle isn't very useful because there's not really anything to travel to, because by that point you'll have fast travel points all over the map, so you don't really need the Master Cycle to travel anywhere because you'll likely have done everything. This DLC came out 9 months after the game released, giving people plenty of time to beat everything. So if you actually want to enjoy this motorbike, you practically have to start a new file, but it is kind of worth it. I really enjoy having a vehicle in an open world game like this. It just does it for me. There's something about having a mostly peaceful world where nature is flourishing, then you just have Link tearing up dirt on his motorbike. Honestly, I just wish more open world games had vehicles like this. It's funny seeing something as mundane as a motorbike be so powerful and out of place in an environment like this. I really just love this thing. But with that being said, it's not all positives. For example, it runs out of fuel, which isn't bad on its own, but it's the rate at which it runs out of fuel. It takes a measly 6 minutes to completely run out of fuel. Then you have to get off, pause the game and chuck in 10 apples. I just wish they doubled the tank's capacity, making it last 12 minutes, but it also requiring double the resources, so 20 apples now. Or hell, you could even times it by 3. I do feel like any more than that would be overkill, but I feel like it would just be much better. It's the exact same fuel requirements, but now you just have to stop 3 times less often. But another thing I hate is that it can't be summoned on Death Mountain or in the Gerudo Desert. Why? Look, I get it has the same programming as the horse, but for obvious reasons it shouldn't. I don't really care about not being able to take it up Death Mountain because the motorbike is best on flat ground, where Death Mountain is very steep with jagged rocks everywhere, as well as the lava being quite hazardous. But the desert? Really? It would be perfect here. It's mostly just flat ground, and you have a movement penalty here as well because of the sand, so being able to overcome that with a motorbike would be great. Not to mention this kind of motorbike is meant for this kind of terrain, so it doesn't even make sense. Look, I'd hate to sound like a self-entitled prick, but I paid extra money for this, and you're seriously going to tell me where I can and can't use this thing for no real reason? I understand not being able to summon it in shrines, since it would be hard to get around in these narrow environments, and you could use it to break the puzzles by being able to pogo off the bike, but outside of the shrine should be fair game. Another thing I want to mention is how the Master Cycle shines a light on the flaws of horses and how useless they are. This is something that I was going to talk about in my original 3 videos, but it's much more relevant here. So my relationship with horses is basically, if I'm doing a lot of traveling and I see a horse, I'll try to grab it, but they're not something that's really worth going out of your way to get because they're only really good at one thing, and that's covering ground on flat terrain. The second you need to climb something, the horse is useless since they can't climb. And you need to climb a lot in this game to get to a bunch of shrines and other locations. Now the horses get a little better if you take them to the horse stables. You gain the ability to whistle and call them to you. After you whistle, they'll come to your location. But this has a very small range, and in my experience, if I climb up a cliff in Hyrule, I usually don't end up coming back down the same cliff that I went up once I'm done with the area that I climbed up the cliff for. I usually head in a different direction, so the horse is now out of range, making it take even longer if I were to backtrack to go get the horse. It would be much more useful if the whistle was global like in previous Zelda games. I know this doesn't make any sense that I can have the horse, then teleport to the other side of the map and call the horse horse and Epona shows up immediately, but it's a convenience thing. And the Master Cycle really puts into perspective just how bad the horses in this game are by being able to summon it at your will, and I'm pretty sure you can use it in areas you can't even get horses into, like this part in the Gerudo Highlands. So in the end, the horses end up being more trouble than they're worth. One final thing I don't like about the Master Cycle is Link doesn't actually turn the handlebars of the vehicle, he just leans to turn. And this looks especially weird when wielding a two-handed weapon. Now this isn't a deal breaker for me, it just ruins a little bit of my immersion. But before I move on, there's one last thing that I want to mention that I think is really cool, and that's the headlights from the Master Cycle light up the Typhol ruins, so you can actually get a pretty decent look at this place, which is something that you normally can't do. So let's finish off this DLC by talking about Kass. This is a character I neglected to mention up until now, because Kass is basically the face of the Champion's Ballad. He shows up at every stage of this DLC, and I hate him. He is literally the embodiment of Breath of the Wild. He is Breath of the Wild if it were a character. Boring, melancholy, and has terrible music. He is constantly yapping on about his past teacher and playing that annoying, repetitive tune over and over again. It loops every 16 seconds. I understand why they gave him music, it's so when you're near him, you know that he's around just in case you might not have seen him, and he needs this because he gives you clues about how to make shrines appear in certain locations, so they made it so you can't miss him by giving him an audio cue, but they could have gone about it in so many different ways. Like, they could have a crazy, kooky man that speaks in riddles and hears voices in his head that tell him the riddles that you need to be able to solve the puzzles like normal, and his audio cue would be him maniacally laughing. I think this would be a much more interesting way of handling a character like this, but that's not what we got in the end. But at least they did finish off Breath of the Wild on quite a high note, with the final Divided Beast being really good and the Master Cycle being a great addition to the game. And now that brings me to the next part of this video, my expectations for Breath of the Wild. Some of them are reasonable, some of them are my imagination run wild, but pretty much all of my expectations were set by something either Miyamoto or Eiji Aonuma said, especially in the early days of this game's development. Like in the very first trailer, Aonuma comes right out and says that he's wanting to return to the conventions of the original Legend of Zelda.
Last year, I said that revisiting the conventions of the Zelda series would be our theme for the new Zelda game for Wii U.
And when I was watching this, I was like, yeah, that's such a great idea, especially for an open world game. But when we get to the finished product, I have to ask, in what ways did Breath of the Wild return to the conventions of the original Legend of Zelda? I mean, sure, you have things like weaker enemies being red and stronger enemies being blue. The raft returns, I guess. You have these trees and Spectacle Rock are here, but that is a recurring structure throughout the Legend of Zelda franchise. And Zelda is in a similar dress to the one she was in Zelda 1, but other than that, that's about it. Now, I know things changed during development, but they didn't take what I think was the most important part of Zelda 1, and that was its structure and, more importantly, its execution. Zelda 1 does something that I really enjoy, and that's something that I'd say no Zelda game has ever truly captured, and that's its big emphasis on exploration. I mean, Zelda 1 starts with a screen opening up, and immediately you have 4 options: up, left, right, or a cave. Please pick the cave. Once you enter the cave and get the sword, after that, you're given no explanation as to where to go or what you're actually here to do. You just run around and explore. After doing that for long enough, eventually you'll come across a dungeon that you found on your own. Nobody told you where it was, you just happen upon it. Same with the items. I mean, you literally just find the power bracelet underneath a random Armoros, and you are rewarded for your exploration, and same goes for the white ring. You just find it being sold by some random guy in a hidden cave, but I love my exploration being rewarded like this, and this is what I was expecting to happen in Breath of the Wild. I was expecting to stub my toe on a rock, tumble down a hill, look up once I've got my bearings, and oh, the entrance to a dungeon. That would have been so cool, but it's not like that at all. All there really is to find is shrines and Korok seeds, which isn't worth this huge open world for such minimal rewards, and that's what I was expecting. The whole franchise feels like it's been building towards an open world format. It feels like the natural evolution for the franchise. Like Zelda 1 kicked everything off, then Zelda 2 happened, which was made in the franchise's infancy, so not a lot that happened in that game really carried over. Then we have A Link to the Past, which felt like the natural evolution of the franchise. It did everything Zelda 1 did, but bigger and better. Now not every screen is a small grid square, making moving through the world feel more natural. Link swings his sword instead of just thrusting it forward, and items and dungeons became more complex than realized, and this game had more of a story. Then you have Ocarina of Time, which made the massive leap from 2D to 3D, again feeling like this is where the franchise was naturally heading. Now Ocarina of Time did play it quite safe in terms of story beats, being very similar to A Link to the Past, where you do 3 start dungeons, collect 3 doohickeys representing power, wisdom and courage before getting the Master Sword. But it's fine for Nintendo to play it safe like this, since the jump from 2D to 3D was the main draw for this game. Link now looks fully realized in 3D, and the dungeons and items are even more complex than before given the new dimension that the 3D offers, things that just couldn't be done before in previous titles, like the hookshot and bow utilizing first-person camera angles to be able to aim at things. Also for sword combat, there is a few new things added like Z-targeting that helps you aim at enemies by making Link face them at all times, making striking them with your sword much easier. You also have a jump attack, and the spin attack is much larger, and Link has a much larger variety of sword swinging animations. You have horizontal swings, vertical swings, and finishing animations for multiple swings. Way more than just a swipe and a spin attack. Then we have Wind Waker and Majora's Mask, which didn't really do too much to forward the franchise. They more did their own thing, shaking up the formula while still retaining the core of a Zelda game. Majora's Mask is mechanically very similar to Ocarina of Time, having many of the same assets as the previous game, but Majora's Mask has more emphasis on the world building, characters, and its side quests, as well as the 3 days repeating. Then in Wind Waker, for its combat, it has more of a rock, paper, scissors feel to it, where each enemy usually has a weakness to some item, like this beetle guy, where you can just one-shot him with the ice arrow. And in Wind Waker, it goes for a completely different direction in its exploration, with you sailing the seas, going to different islands, with the small islands being the main areas that you explore. Now this is a fine system, but I don't think it's the direction the rest of the franchise should take. Then we have Twilight Princess, which again feels like an evolution of Ocarina of Time. For example, Midna as a companion actually feels like a character, unlike Nevi, and the swordplay feels much better. You can swing your sword while on horseback, as well as Epona not feeling as clunky as in Ocarina of Time. And you can swing your sword underwater and chop while moving. You learn a bunch of different sword techniques after getting bitten by a dog that spice up the combat. Some items from previous Zelda games have new functions, like the iron boots as previously mentioned in my other videos, and the claw shot. When hanging, you can reel it up and down. Bombs can be used underwater as well as on your arrows, giving them a bunch of new utility you would expect to see as the franchise progresses. But then we have Skyward Sword, and like Wind Waker and Majora's Mask, it's not really a conventional Zelda game where it almost completely removes the exploration aspect and changes it into a linear game, and the combat is done with motion controls, where a lot of the combat is built around the direction that you swing your sword, so not very conventional at all. It does, however, keep some of the combat techniques from Twilight Princess, like the shield bash turned into shield parry and finishing blow, which are both available straight off the bat. But then we have Breath of the Wild, which seems to be a return to a more conventional Zelda game format like Twilight Princess, but with the huge change that it is now open world, and honestly, this feels like what the franchise had been moving towards the whole time. The open world feels right for this franchise, a franchise that is all about exploration. One thing that has bugged me about this franchise is these walls that surround the play area that you explore. They just feel so unnatural. I know that they had to do this when making those earlier titles, but Breath of the Wild does away with these unnatural walls, giving you the freedom to explore wherever you want. But Breath of the Wild decided to try and do a lot of new and different things while removing a lot of what the rest of the franchise had been building up to. They added new things like the armor system, the cooking, the climbing, the weapon durability, when I feel like tackling something so new and as massive as an open world format, they should have played it a lot safer, going with what already worked in previous titles, and added to the franchise instead of taking away what already worked. They should have done what Ocarina of Time did for A Link to the Past, where, like I mentioned before, it was such a huge transition from 2D to 3D, they didn't want to mess with what already worked, and they just made it work in this new format. Then Majora's Mask, after the success of Ocarina of Time, decided to break some of the conventions of the franchise and did new and weird things, which would have been really polarizing if Ocarina of Time didn't come first. And this seems to be the reverse case for Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild did all the new and weird things, while Breath of the Wild 2, I feel, will be a return to format. Since if there was one genuine criticism I heard from most people, even the ones that loved Breath of the Wild, was it was a good game, but a bad Zelda game. Now, I would argue that this wasn't even a good game, but that's not the point. The point is Nintendo does listen to criticism, especially this kind where the majority feel this way, so I do feel they will at least try to make a Zelda game this time. I feel 100% certain that dungeons will be returning, as well as items. They might start you off with a few, but hopefully you get more as you progress the game. And that brings me to my next big expectation for Breath of the Wild: the items and dungeons, the most important part of a Zelda game. I had no reason to suspect the execution behind the items and dungeons would be altered in any major way for this game. This is a thing that has been pretty much unchanged for the whole franchise's lifespan. Even the Zelda games that really changed things up, like Zelda 2, Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, and Skyward Sword, did nothing to change up the dynamic of the items and the dungeons. And for good reason. The way a normal Zelda game works is you get items from dungeons that let you access things in the overworld, things that you cannot access without certain items, essentially making it a system of locks and keys. If you have a set of boulders that block your path, essentially this area is locked until you get the right key, the bombs in this case. But instead of them being just a regular boring key that you unlock things with, it's a fun key, or funkies TM, as I like to call them. With this funky, you get a satisfying explosion. With others, you might get to grind along a wall and jump from wall to wall. This is fun, and I love this system. When the game opens up, you'll inevitably come across something that is currently locked off from you, since you don't currently own the correct funky to be able to do whatever you need to do to unlock whatever's being locked off from you. You have to keep it in the back of your mind until you get that funky. Breath of the Wild, on the other hand, gives you all the keys from the get-go, so since you have all the keys, essentially there's no locks, nothing to keep in the back of your mind, and this was a big disappointment for me. I was expecting dungeons that you would randomly happen upon that would contain an item. For a game like Breath of the Wild, I was being withheld and only expecting about 8 spread across a world of this size. And like a usual Zelda game, once you have a certain item, you can access new things that you couldn't before, giving the game a little structure. And it would actually make these stamps that you can put on your map actually useful, given the fact that there will be things that you actually have to come back for. Another thing I love about Zelda games is knowledge is power. The better you know these games, the more fun they become. Because when you know where everything is and how to get them and when you can get them, these games change. They become all about item routing and optimization, which is really fun to do. For example, in Ocarina of Time, just after you've beaten Jabu Jabu's belly, pretty much everything you can do as young Link opens up to you. So I start by giving the bunny hood to the running man. After that, he gives me 500 rupees, and then I go buy the remaining magic beans. I then go to Lon Lon Ranch, play the Kaku minigame, get Epona's song, get the piece of heart in the shed, play the sun song, get the 4 skull tulers. Now Lon Lon Ranch is complete. After that, I head for the Gerudo Valley, get the skull tuler in the hole nearby, get the skull tuler above the waterfall, get the piece of heart behind the waterfall, plant the magic bean, get the skull tuler nearby, follow the river down to Lake Hylia, plant the next magic bean, get the skull tuler on the back of the lab, get the scarecrow song set up, then go to the fishing pond, catch the fish, get the piece of heart, then head to Fire Arrow Island, get the skull tuler, then head to the owl, talk to him, let him take you to Hyrule Castle Town, get dropped off straight into the Ganondorf cutscene, and bam, that whole sequence feels super satisfying to pull off. But Breath of the Wild could have had item routing like this, but no, of course it doesn't. Like, if you could get the hookshot from a dungeon and it worked like I said in my first Breath of the Wild video, where you can hook onto any climbable surface, that would give you a huge amount of utility and help you get around quicker, and it would let you get to other dungeons and get their items quicker, and then you can plan routes around their abilities. And Breath of the Wild's open world would be perfect for this kind of routing, since isn't this what an open world like this should be for? Now that's what I expected from this game. It just makes so much sense to have it work like this, but instead now I'm just left here wondering why they even bothered making it an open world game, since if you ask me, it wasn't even close to being utilized to its fullest potential. So now there is one final expectation I want to talk about before I move on to Breath of the Wild, and that's secrets. Every Zelda game has its fair share of secrets. Usually these take the form of a hole or a bombable wall, a secret area, or rarely an entire hidden section to a dungeon. I still get really excited when I get to this part of Ocarina of Time where you go up this elevator to the secret part of the dungeon. It just feels like I'm not supposed to be here, and I love it. Also, Breath of the Wild doesn't have any secret bombable walls, which is kind of a crime. This has been a staple of the series since Zelda 1 with all the bombable walls everywhere in Hyrule, and you just have to try and bomb everywhere to find all the secrets. It's a lot of fun knowing that you found a secret because you were dedicated to finding it by just trying stuff out. It can be a little unfun to use up all your bombs while you look for these, since there's no indicator if a wall is bombable or not, but in A Link to the Past they made it so if you hit a bombable wall with your sword, it makes a different tink sound than when you hit a normal wall. And this has been in most Zelda games since. Wind Waker and Twilight Princess don't actually have any fake bombable walls, but they were brought back in Skyward Sword, and they still do the same tink thing. And they're also quite well hidden as well. Like this one, for example. I didn't even know this one was here until a couple years ago, and I've been playing this game for over 12 years, and I'm still finding new things. Sure, it was just a rare material, but there are a few things that beat finding something new in a game that you've played many times. It's super rewarding when you decide to take a closer look at something and you find a secret and boom, your mind explodes. And I was expecting this in Breath of the Wild. I gave this game 200 hours of my time before I realized I didn't like it. I beat all 120 shrines after about 100 hours, and then I spent the next 100 hours scouring the map looking for secrets, only finding Koroks. The idea that this was all that there was had begun to set in by that point, but I gave the game the benefit of the doubt and I said no. Obviously, I'm just not looking in any of the right places. I was waiting for that moment where I found that thing that changed the way I played and saw Breath of the Wild. That thing that I could get excited to reach in my next playthrough now that I know it's there. But if you're familiar with this game, then you know that moment never came. I played this game for 200 hours, then I looked on the internet and found nobody else had found anything worthwhile in this game either, and that's when the confusion and disappointment set in. I thought, isn't this what an open world Zelda game is for? To have this format that allows you to do things with a franchise you just couldn't do before, expanding on this franchise in new and exciting ways, but no, they took away so much that the franchise had established before, and now this brings me to Breath of the Wild 2. So everything from this point on is newer than the last two sections of the video. The rest was done a while ago since I was waiting for the new trailer to come out because I was expecting there would be some important information shown, and there was. I would like to start this part with my expectations for the game, and then I'll talk about the trailer, what I'm excited for, what concerns me, and then just rampant speculation because it's fun to speculate about things. Also, I'm not going to get Tears of the Kingdom on release. I'm going to do the responsible thing and wait for it and look at what this game actually offers before buying it. If Breath of the Wild 2 does good things for the franchise, I'll support that decision and buy the game, but if it basically turns out to be Breath of the Wild again, I'm just flat out not interested. I thought I'd give you that context because it's going to shape my perspective, but with all that being said, basically everything I said in my previous section is now applied to Breath of the Wild 2, but this time I think some of my expectations may actually be met. Now, I'm going to try and keep them reasonable. For example, my ideas about secrets, while I do think it's possible that they do have some really well hidden things, it's just as much possibility that they don't. It's the sort of thing that we just have to wait and see. Again, I do feel like it would be a massive missed opportunity to not have secrets in an open world like this, but anyway, let's talk about the big stuff. The dungeons. I think they're guaranteed in this game since we haven't seen any dungeon compensation like the shrines or divine beasts from Breath of the Wild, so with all the new stuff up in the sky and the underground areas, I think there's a very good chance for the normal standard dungeon experience. Now, how many? I'm not sure. I feel like maybe only 4 or 6 of them, given I feel like we will probably still have things that function like shrines, but I think there'll be far fewer of them, probably being only around 30 of them, since I do still think they're going to struggle with the issue of filling this world with content. I do think shrines will be a little more involved than in Breath of the Wild, where each shrine only had one concept per shrine, instead of having a bunch of different puzzles for you to solve as you navigate through these environments, so they will probably be more like the mini dungeons from Ocarina of Time, like the Ice Cavern and Bottom of the Well, where they act like your typical dungeon experience, but being quite a bit shorter. If we get a bunch of those, I'll be super happy. But let's talk about the other important aspect of dungeons, and that's the items. AGR Numa said in an interview that he prefers the new design philosophy of players having all the items from the start of the game, allowing for freedom of player choice, meaning the old way I enjoy Zelda games with item routing is pretty much confirmed dead at this point. I mean, when you consider that Twilight Princess was the last original Zelda game to have any semblance of item routing, since Skyward Sword didn't have any because it's a linear game and A Link Between Worlds does have some, but not really, and this is the game where the philosophy of player choice started, since all the items are in one location, like Breath of the Wild, but its execution is much better. I went into more detail in my previous video, but the point is, Twilight Princess was the last Zelda game to work by the player gets items from dungeons, which let you proceed and unlock stuff in the overworld, and that game came out in 2006, over 16 years ago, so yeah, Breath of the Wild 2 is not going to bring back that philosophy, which again is a shame given I feel like a world like this would be perfect to route. Like, I mean, have you heard of an item randomizer? These take that thing that I said earlier where knowledge is power and cranks it up to 11, because now knowledge is required. You have to know where to get items, what items can be used to unlock certain things for you, and depending on what items you have access to, determine the path that you take throughout the game. Wind Waker is easily the best game for this format since the whole map is open to you and there's a lot accessible early on. Now this is something that I'll be talking about more in my how to remake Wind Waker video, but Breath of the Wild could have been the same. And before you say, yes, I know there's randomizers for Breath of the Wild, but no, they're not item randomizers since there's no items to randomize. Any Zelda game worth its salt has an item randomizer. Now Breath of the Wild 2 might not have items to route, but that's not the only thing that you can route in these games. You can also route upgrades. If Link gets upgrades for his arsenal, and assuming they are substantial upgrades and assuming they are in different locations requiring you to actually explore Breath of the Wild, I'm looking at you and calling it now. This bit with the guardian claws coming out of the ground is going to be the way Link pack-a-punches his Sheikah Arms abilities, which will be great. Hey, Future Doom Kirby here. So this video took a little bit longer to get out than I originally thought it was going to, and in that time a new gameplay showcase and trailer have dropped for Breath of the Wild 2. So needless to say, some of the things that I talk about in this next part are a little bit out of date, but I decided to keep it in because I think some of my points that I make are still relevant, and also I think it's just kind of funny to see how hopeful and naive I was for thinking that we might actually be in for a Zelda game this time. Most of those hopes have been dashed at this point, so feel free to make fun of me for any of the predictions that I make that are just totally wrong at this point. Anyway, on with the rest of the video. So that brings me to the new Breath of the Wild Tears of the Kingdom trailer, because there's a bit to talk about. Firstly, the vehicles. They sure know how to get me, don't they? Since if I get Tears of the Kingdom, it's mostly because of the vehicles. So I was worried about how they were going to bring back the Master Cycle in Breath of the Wild 2, because it was easily my favorite part of the first game. So if they didn't have it in the sequel, it would have been a huge step backwards in my opinion. They seem to improve it by adding buildable vehicles, which looks like a lot of fun to mess around with. I just hope that it's an important mechanic to the game and not something that can be skipped if you don't want to use it. Each vehicle needs to have a purpose. Another thing I wonder is, what are the limits to it? I would imagine they have a fuel limit, but it might make it hard to get so high in the sky since it doesn't look like it's very fast. Also, I wonder if you can take a vehicle to another vehicle's build site and then combine them. And if you went around to all the sites in the game, can you make like a super vehicle? I doubt it, but it'll be fun to try. And does this remind anybody else of Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts? Now I want to talk about my concerns. There are 3 things that concern me about Tears of the Kingdom. So see this apple? This could be the apple that ruins everything. So I was not a fan of the cooking mechanic in Breath of the Wild, to say the least. It completely breaks the balance of the game, given you can hold an entire inventory's worth of food and you can just pause the game and heal up if you feel like you're in even the slightest bit of danger. Now I have a video that really shows the extent of how exploitable this was and how hard it would be to actually die. So if it returns without being fixed, it's going to be a huge strike against Tears of the Kingdom, especially since it looks like this game might actually have proper bosses this time, which having a food exploit would completely trivialize any good bosses this game may actually have. Hopefully they bring back bottles, which would add a limit to the amount of heals that you can carry with you at any given time, and maybe they could have them hidden around the world, giving players something else to look out for while exploring the world, as well as having a new collectible that upgrades Link's holding capacity. So the next thing that concerns me is how the armor system is going to work. So in Breath of the Wild 1, there was a bunch of different armors you could get your hands on, and most of them were completely useless, like this one for example. It gives you an electricity damage reduction, but do you know what else gives you an electricity damage reduction? Upgrading any armor set in the game. And this becomes completely redundant if you have the Thunder Helmet. And another thing I didn't like was how often the game made you pause and switch up the set that you were wearing because of environmental changes. Oh, I'm in the water, better switch to the Zora tunic, now I'm climbing. Put the climbing gear on. It's cold resistant armor. It got to the point where I got sick of pausing the game and switching tunic, where I said enough is enough, I'm just going to wear the green tunic unless I'm on Death Mountain. It really broke the flow of the game, and it was just a really unfun thing to do overall. Now that's just part of the reason why I don't like the armors in Breath of the Wild, but the main reason I don't like the armors was because it made you so incredibly tanky with a maxed out set, to the point where only the absolute strongest attacks would do anything to your health bar, making the game too easy. But it looks like Breath of the Wild 2 might not have this problem, given we have mostly seen Link in his champion's outfit. And like I pointed out in my first video, when Link is up in the sky, he doesn't appear to be freezing anymore, and when on Death Mountain, no fire armor either, making it seem like there's only the champion set, which hopefully that's the case, given it would streamline getting upgrades for his armor, or maybe there will be no upgrades for armor at all. So if something hits you for 20 damage, it will always hit you for that amount of damage. And the original trailers for Breath of the Wild 1 support my idea that he will only have one set in this game, given we see Link in a whole bunch of different outfits in those trailers. Now the green garb Link is wearing could be a temporary set that he wears until he gets the champion's outfit, like in Twilight and Skyward Sword, where Link starts in casual clothes and then gets the green tunic. And the last thing that concerns me is weapon durability. I know this is something that I never really talked about that much in my original 3 videos, but that's just because I didn't really want to beat a dead horse. Everybody hates the durability in that game, and I agree. So I would be shocked if it returns in this game. And given Link is always found sporting the same bow, shield and sword, from what I can see anyway, except for this one scene where he's wearing the Traveler's Shield from the first game. Now this could be because it's just an early trailer for the game, so things like this could change, because in the second trailer we see no change in shield. Or they could be bringing back Skyward Sword system where only the shields have durability, which I would love to see come back, as well as the durability bar, so we can tell how much durability the shields actually have. The next thing I want to talk about is Breath of the Wild 2's world. This could be a double-edged sword, given that it's the very same world as the last game. A world that I know quite well, so for at least some part of it, it's going to be a little uninteresting to explore a world that I've already explored again. I can't think of another game that's ever done this before. Yes, you have the occasional game that might reuse the same area from a game that came before. Games that spring to mind are Portal. They reuse some of the early test chambers from the first game, and Dark Souls has you revisit Anor Londo in Dark Souls 3 from Dark Souls 1, which in both cases feels like an homage to the earlier games, but in Breath of the Wild's case it feels more lazy than anything, not an homage. And the 2 examples I gave reuse the same single area, while Breath of the Wild is reusing the whole map again. But with that being said, I do want to be fair on the developers, because once Breath of the Wild was done, the question of now what would have come up. What do we do with the franchise next? Make another open world Zelda game? Return to the format of a more classic Zelda style? Try something completely new? Or do a sequel to Breath of the Wild? After completing a world of this size, the last thing I'd imagine they would want to do is make another new Zelda game in an open world setting and have to start from scratch all over again. So they opted for the sequel approach, given the success of Breath of the Wild 1. But here's the thing, if they fail to fill this world with stuff worth exploring for again, I don't think they're going to get away with it this time. So if they give us 120 shrines or shrine-like things and the Koroks and slightly change the layout of the map, I do feel like people will call them out for being lazy. But I'll be honest and say I don't think that will be the case. With the introduction of the new Sky environments and the underground areas and a bunch of new enemies that we've already seen, it looks like there'll be plenty of new areas to explore and things to do. And I'll be honest, I am really excited to go around this map again and see what's actually changed in each area. Like, I'm really looking forward to checking out Terrytown and seeing if it's there. I don't mind if it's been destroyed, just so long as it's not in the same state that we find it in Breath of the Wild, because that would make From the Grounds Up not be canon, and that would be a real shame. But the location I really want to check out is the Forgotten Temple. I'll be heading straight there once I finish up with the tutorial area, which I assume will be up in the sky withholding the paraglider from you, just like like the first game, preventing you from leaving the tutorial area. I'm looking forward to seeing how it's changed. It was easily the coolest area in Breath of the Wild 1, and it's an area of slight significance given it was the location where you found the green tunic, and it might open up into an actual underground area, which I'm looking forward to seeing more of. It's been way too long, old friend. And another thing I think would be super cool is if all 120 shrines from Breath of the Wild 1 were found in Tears of the Kingdom in the exact same locations, but all inactive, obviously. That would be a super neat bit of fan service for those few Breath of the Wild 1 fans out there. It would also be really cool if in some underground areas you can actually see the outside structures of the shrines, given that they are underground as well. I think that would be a super neat detail and it would make the world feel more cohesive, but I doubt it. Now, before I end this video, I want to leave you on a more positive note for these games by saying that despite everything in Breath of the Wild 1 that I don't like, despite how flawed I think some of the parts of this game are, I still do find myself enjoying parts of this game. Yes, they are very few, mostly being the Great Plateau, some shrines, the Divine Beast, and a little bit of the navigation is fun. Even if worst case scenario Breath of the Wild 2 turns out to be exactly that and is just Breath of the Wild again, but bigger and better, I will still find myself enjoying more of it than I did Breath of the Wild 1. I still don't see it beating a real Zelda game, but who knows, it might come close and be a really fantastic game, and I hope that it is. I hope it tries to appeal to classic Zelda and Breath of the Wild fans alike, since I think they can only gain from doing that. There is one negative thing that I want to say about Breath of the Wild 2. So far, the voice acting has not been improved from the first game. It's still awful, and the voice for Ganondorf is really bad. The voice actor sounds like they're trying way too hard to be evil, to the point where it becomes comical. It's going to be hard to take this iteration of Ganondorf seriously if he sounds like this.
Leave no survivors!
I find it really hard to not break out into laughter when I hear him. And this is really bad because between Beef Jerky Ganon and Calamity Ganon, I'm concerned we're in for another villain that doesn't have much impact on the world. But my concerns out of the way, I really do hope that you enjoy this game and it was worth the wait. And who knows, if it does turn out to be great, I might even pick it up. But with that being said, I also want to say, please do keep in mind that Breath of the Wild 2 will most likely not be a perfect game, so allow people to critique it. Just because you enjoy something doesn't mean that it's flawless, so please don't ignore a game's flaws just because you love it. Talking about something's flaws is a good thing, because if the criticism is constructive, we can only benefit from it because things might get improved in the future. So that's it for this video, and with all that being said, now...
I never want to see your ridiculous face again! Where am I? What is this?
It's just a dream. Shh.